The Negative Effects of Violent Video Games by Emma Demmer, Morgan Fawson, and Kelly Hart. 85% of games require players to physically attack other characters to win the game. 57% of games rated for all audiences contained violence. There are many negative effects that people can acquire from playing violent video games. There have even been reports of teenagers killing family members and other players with guns due to their playing of violent video games.
Here's a quote from a study about empathetic concern. Long-term exposures of violent video games has been associated with lower levels of empathetic concern in a number of studies looking at children. A quote from a study about pain tolerance gives another perspective on the topic of violence associated with violent video games. Participants in the experimental groups exhibited higher pain tolerance than participants in the control groups. Violent video games are positively correlated with aggressive actions and thoughts, as well as decreased empathy in their players and a rise in suicidal thoughts or actions. Here are some definitions for your convenience.
We will talk about how this affects the behavioral areas of aggression, empathy, and suicide.
Argue that there is a poor connection between violent media and aggressive or antisocial behavior. However, there is solid data that proves that video games specifically are linked to aggressive behavior. The argument that there is no evidence connecting violent video games to aggressive behavior is only one side of the debate. However, violent video games have directly been linked to aggressive behaviors, low empathetic concern, and suicidal thoughts.
Behavior can be heavily influenced by the amount of violence and time spent playing video games. Those who may have noticed the rising aggression start to think that this new behavior is normal. Aggressive behavior is not only influenced by the violence in video games, but it is also influenced by the profanity within the games. Researchers say profanity is a prominent form of verbal aggression that has received attention as a potentially problematic presence in some video games. Teenagers who are exposed to profanity in video games have been proved to engage in behavioral and verbal aggression. Research says adolescents' exposure to profanity in video games and television was correlated with their engaging in both physical and relational aggression.
Not only do violent video games cause aggressive behaviors, but there is also a direct connection between gaming and low empathetic concern towards others. Some research has been conducted, and this is what they found. Participants responded to 5 items on a 5-point scale ranging from 1 not like me at all to 5 very much like me. One sample question included, I am often quite touched by the things I see happen to others, with higher scores indicating lower empathetic concern. This reveals that interaction with violent video games causes the players to become sheltered or antisocial. Other research says participants' empathetic concern was examined using a shortened version of the empathetic concern subscale, which states violent media increases the cognitive numbness. This quote proves that violent video games can decrease one's senses and feelings.
Exposure to violent video games increases lower empathetic concern in players, and although this is a prevalent topic, another result of violent video games is suicidal thoughts or behaviors. The aspect of suicide is the acquired capability to commit suicide, which deals with the lowered fear of death and increased pain tolerance. Theismann, who has a doctorate degree in psychotherapy, states that acquired capability for suicide arises from repeated exposure to painful and or fear-inducing experiences. 2 dimensions of acquired capability: lowered fear of death and increased tolerance for pain. A study was conducted to further examine the connection between violent video games and suicide. It showed participants in the experimental groups exhibited higher pain tolerance than participants in the control groups. The 2 experimental groups and the control groups didn't differ from each other, which proves violent video games exhibit higher pain tolerance in their players. Violent video games have been around for a while now and bring out negative effects on their players, effects such as aggressive behavior, decreased empathetic concern, and suicidal thoughts. Future reference: teenagers and people in general become hostile and aggressive when interacting with violent video games, so by limiting those interactions, loved ones are safe from potentially being harmed or even killed by other individuals.